When I heard the knock on the door and opened it to see him standing there, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, a crooked smile on his face, I felt my stomach tighten. But not because I was surprised. I'd been preparing for this moment all morning, adjusting pillows on the guest bed, cooking more than necessary for dinner, checking my reflection more than usual. What unsettled me was how easily he walked back into our lives, into my life, as if no time had passed since that summer long ago. My husband greeted him like nothing had changed, as if he were still that awkward teenager he used to be. But he wasn't. He'd grown into a man, taller, sharper, more self-assured. And when his eyes met mine, there was a flicker of something else. Something I wasn't ready to name. I laughed too much at dinner. I asked too many questions. I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, the kind that hadn't visited me in years. That night, when my husband fell asleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling, counting the years of silence between us. It had started long before the knock on the door. Much earlier. I didn't plan for what happened next. But maybe, deep down, I was waiting for something, anything, that would make me feel again. Let me take you back to the beginning. The real beginning. Before the mistake. Before the motel. Before I did what I can't undo. But first, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and answer this: have you ever had a moment you didn't plan for, but somehow knew it would come? Every morning followed the same rhythm. The same movements in the same rooms, like choreography my body knew by heart. I'd rise early, shuffle down the hallway in my slippers, boil water for tea, then sit by the window and wait for the sun to slide over the treetops. Our house sat far from the city, tucked into a quiet slope with neighbors so distant you could go days without seeing a soul. Some would call it peaceful. I used to. But lately, peace had started to feel more like absence. Silence didn't soothe me anymore, it pressed in on me. Especially when he wasn't home. Which was often. My husband had always been practical. Steady. He loved routines and plans, and he stuck to them like rules etched into stone. He never missed a bill, never left dishes in the sink, never forgot to check the locks before bed. But somewhere along the way, that same steadiness had turned cold. We no longer shared a bed out of affection, it was habit. Conversations were functional. Affection, occasional, mechanical. Still, I didn't complain. I had a warm home, food on the table, and a man who never looked at another woman. It should have been enough. That morning, he walked into the kitchen carrying a stack of folded clothes. My nephew's moving into town. I told him he could stay in the guest room while he looks for a place. I blinked. Which nephew? You remember, the one from my sister's side. You met him years ago. He was quiet. Used to play the piano. I nodded slowly, though the image was vague. A skinny teenager with messy hair, too shy to hold a conversation. He's staying with us? Just for a bit. He needs a place to land. There was no asking me if I minded. Just an announcement. A decision made. And yet, I didn't resist. The thought of someone new in the house stirred something unexpected. Not excitement, exactly. Just a shift. A disruption. Something unfamiliar in a life defined by sameness. I spent the afternoon cleaning the guest room. I changed the sheets, wiped down surfaces that hadn't been touched in months, and placed a book I hadn't finished on the nightstand just in case he liked to read. Then I stood in the doorway and looked at the bed, wondering who this man had become. Wondering if he'd still be quiet. He arrived just after 6. I saw his silhouette through the glass before he rang the bell. Tall. Confident. Not a boy. When I opened the door, I nearly didn't recognize him. His face was sharper now, his posture sure. He smiled, and there was no trace of the timid teenager. "Hi," he said, his voice low and warm. "You probably don't remember me." I smiled back. "I remember you. Just not like this." We laughed. My husband took his bag and led him inside. They disappeared down the hall, catching up, their voices low and familiar. I stood for a moment longer at the door, heart fluttering in a way that made no sense. Dinner was a blur. I must have asked a dozen questions, where he'd studied, why he moved, what his plans were. He was charming without trying. Funny. Attentive. When he spoke, he looked directly at me. Really looked. And when I laughed, he seemed pleased. After dinner, my husband went to take a call in his study, and I offered to show him the guest room. "It's nice," he said, setting down his bag. "You've made it feel like home." "I tried," I replied, suddenly aware of how close we were standing. He turned to me, and for a split second, the air felt charged. I stepped back, coughed lightly. "If you need anything, just ask." That night, I couldn't sleep. My husband snored beside me, steady and oblivious. I stared at the ceiling, hearing every creak of the floorboards. I thought about the way our guest had smiled. The way he'd listened. And how long it had been since anyone had done either. In the days that followed, I tried to dismiss the feelings. He was just being polite. That was all. But it didn't explain why I found myself adjusting my blouse before coming downstairs. Or why I looked forward to breakfast. Or why I lingered in the kitchen, hoping to hear his footsteps. He was kind to me in small ways. He asked about my interests. Noticed when I wore something different. Remembered what I liked in my tea. It was nothing, and yet, it was everything. One afternoon, I caught him looking at a picture on the mantel. It was me, taken years ago at the coast. My hair was windswept, my eyes crinkled with laughter. "You look happy here," he said. I shrugged. That was a good day. It's hard to remember them sometimes. He turned to me slowly. "I hope you still have them." I didn't know what to say. No one had asked me that in a long time. By the end of the week, I was no longer pretending. I was aware of him constantly. How he moved. How he spoke. How I felt in his presence. It scared me. But it also reminded me that I was still alive. Still a woman. Not just someone's wife. Not just part of the furniture in a quiet house. And I wasn't sure if that realization was a blessing or a warning. The morning after he arrived, everything in the house felt subtly altered. Nothing was out of place, no objects moved or misplaced, but the energy had shifted. I felt it in the kitchen as I stirred my tea, the way the silence no longer felt like solitude but like something was about to be said. My husband read the newspaper as always, his glasses slipping down his nose. The sound of the spoon tapping the edge of the cup seemed louder than usual. He came into the room just after I set the plates down. His hair was slightly messy, and he wore a simple shirt with rolled sleeves. He smiled and said good morning as if we were old friends, not strangers linked only by a surname I'd married into. I answered too quickly, too brightly. My husband didn't notice. He rarely did. At breakfast, conversation flowed between them, updates about family, distant cousins, news from the city. I barely listened. I watched instead. The way he leaned forward when he spoke, the ease in his voice, the comfort he carried in his body. I felt like an observer in my own home, watching a play unfold in which I was both cast and forgotten. Later that day, he found me outside, tending to the plants by the fence. I didn't hear him approach at first. His voice caught me mid-thought. "These are beautiful," he said, motioning to the pale yellow flowers lining the walkway. They bloom late, I replied. But when they do, it's worth the wait. He nodded, eyes on the petals. Kind of like some people, I guess. I looked at him, unsure if the comment was casual or something more. He didn't elaborate. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Just different. That afternoon, he asked if there were any places around town worth exploring. I offered to show him the antique shop I occasionally visited when I needed to feel something different: dust, history, the weight of old stories. He agreed without hesitation. We drove in near silence. I pointed out landmarks, told him about a bakery that had the best sourdough, the bench by the river I used to sit on when I needed time alone. He listened, occasionally asking a question, but mostly letting me speak. I hadn't talked that much in weeks. The antique shop was tucked behind a bookstore, a narrow storefront with a crooked bell above the door. Inside, it smelled of old pages and time. He wandered off to look at vinyl records while I moved toward the back, where the mirrors and forgotten trinkets were kept. I traced my fingers over a silver compact, the kind my grandmother used to carry in her purse. It was tarnished but still beautiful. In its reflection, I caught a glimpse of him watching me from across the room. I looked away quickly, my heart jumping. He came over slowly, hands in his pockets. You look at those things like they mean something. They do, I said, not turning. They used to belong to someone. That means something to me. I didn't expect him to understand. But he just nodded. I like that you notice details. Most people don't. We left the shop with nothing purchased but with something taken. I couldn't name it yet, but it hung between us on the drive back, an awareness, quiet but unmistakable. That evening, we ate dinner together again. My husband was tired from work and went to bed early, leaving us in the living room with a half-finished bottle of wine and a quiet movie playing on low volume. I sat on the edge of the couch, legs tucked beneath me, unsure why I hadn't left the room when my husband did. He sat at the other end, one arm stretched over the back cushion. You're different here, he said suddenly, not looking at me. At home you seemed more restrained. I glanced over. Here, I have space to think. He nodded, still watching the screen. It suits you. I didn't reply. My skin tingled, and not from the wine. When the credits rolled, we sat in silence. I stood to collect the glasses and take them to the kitchen, but as I reached for his, our fingers touched. It wasn't an accident. And we both knew it. We kissed. It was brief. It was quiet. It was enough. I stepped back, heart racing, the glass trembling in my hand. Neither of us spoke. The moment hung in the air like steam over hot water, fragile and real. He didn't apologize. I didn't ask why. Later that night, in bed beside my husband, I lay still with my eyes open. The kiss repeated in my mind like a skipped record. Over and over. I didn't want to erase it. The next day, I woke early, as always. Made tea. Opened the curtains. The morning light filtered in, casting long shadows across the floor. He wasn't up yet. My husband was already gone for the day. The house was quiet again. But nothing felt the same. The morning passed in small tasks I forced upon myself, sweeping the floor, rearranging the spice cabinet, folding towels that weren't even used. I moved through the house like someone trying to remember what normal felt like. But the truth was everything had changed, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. Not after what happened. Not after that kiss. He came into the kitchen just as I was wiping the counter for the third time. His steps were slow, almost hesitant, and when our eyes met, something unspoken passed between us. We didn't mention the night before. We didn't need to. It clung to the space between us like a scent that wouldn't wash off. He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter near the window. The morning light caught in his hair, and I caught myself staring for a moment too long. I turned away quickly, pretending to search for something in a drawer. I told myself I should keep my distance. That it had been a moment of weakness, a foolish lapse in judgment that could be corrected if ignored. But denial is a weak guard when temptation stands in the next room. The house felt smaller that day. Every hallway felt tighter, every silence louder. I avoided lingering in shared spaces. I stayed in the garden longer than usual, pruning plants that didn't need pruning. The sun burned my neck, but I welcomed the sting. It made me feel grounded, real. In the afternoon, I heard footsteps behind me. He'd come outside too, holding a glass of water, pretending, perhaps, that this was just another visit to check in. He said he needed fresh air. I didn't argue. We stood a few feet apart, watching the breeze stir the leaves. He asked if I wanted to take a walk. I hesitated, heart quickening. But I nodded. Saying no would have felt like a lie. We took the trail behind the property, one that led down toward the old bridge. I'd walked it many times alone, but never with someone beside me. The path was narrow in places, and more than once our arms brushed. I pretended not to notice, but I did. Every time. He asked questions about the house, the land, the years I'd spent here. I answered carefully, choosing safe words. But inside, I felt the tremor of every step, the tension building like a rope pulled too tight. We reached the clearing near the water. There was a bench made of weathered wood, half covered in moss. I sat without thinking, and he joined me. I stared at the water, unsure what to say. Unsure if I wanted to say anything at all. After a while, he broke the silence. He spoke gently, as if weighing every word. He said he didn't want to complicate things. That he didn't come here with intentions. But sometimes life gives you moments you weren't looking for. And sometimes those moments matter more than the ones you planned. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. My silence was already an answer. On the way back, the wind had picked up. The trees whispered above us, and I couldn't help but feel that they knew. That nature, in all its quiet watching, had seen me do something I couldn't take back. That evening, I prepared dinner in silence. My husband came home late, exhausted from work. He kissed my cheek without really looking and asked about his mail. I handed him the envelopes, heart pounding, eyes avoiding his. He didn't notice my nervousness. He rarely did. He went to the living room after eating, the television humming in the background. I stood in the kitchen, hands submerged in warm soapy water, scrubbing a plate that was already clean. The guest came in behind me and reached into the cupboard for a glass. Our shoulders nearly touched. I didn't move. He said goodnight quietly. I turned, looked at him, and nodded. My throat felt tight. That night, I sat in bed with the lights off long after my husband had fallen asleep. I stared at the ceiling and replayed every word, every glance, every step from the walk. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. That it could still be nothing. That lines hadn't been fully crossed. But deep down, I knew they had. And no amount of silence could unwalk the path we had just taken. I didn't sleep. I watched the clock tick past midnight. I thought about how things start, how something so small can change the direction of a life. One glance. One touch. One moment. And I wondered how many more moments it would take before I couldn't turn back. The next few days passed with an unsettling rhythm. My routine was unchanged on the surface: laundry, dishes, errands, but inside, nothing felt familiar. My thoughts moved in circles, revisiting every word, every look, every step I had taken since he arrived. I wasn't sure if I was trying to understand something or forget it. My husband was busy with work. He came home late, distracted, speaking in half sentences. He didn't notice how quiet I'd become or how I flinched when he touched my back in passing. To him, I was still the same, still reliable, still there. But I felt like a shadow version of myself, moving beside the woman he remembered. One evening, after dinner, he surprised me with a small box wrapped in plain paper. He handed it to me casually, almost as if it didn't matter, but I could see a flicker of something nervous in his expression. "I saw this in a shop window," he said. "Thought of you." I opened the box and found a delicate necklace inside. Thin gold, with a small, leaf-shaped pendant. It was beautiful. Tasteful. I ran my fingers over it, unsure how to respond. Not because I didn't like it, but because I didn't know how to receive a gesture that came from a version of him I hadn't seen in years. "Thank you," I said quietly. He smiled, kissed my temple, and left the room. I sat there for a while, holding the box. I wasn't sure if the guilt I felt was because of what had already happened, or what hadn't yet, but soon could. The next morning, I wore the necklace. I told myself it was a gesture of appreciation, nothing more. But when he saw it, his eyes softened in a way that caught me off guard. "You look nice today," he said. I smiled, murmured thanks, and turned away before he could see how much that small compliment had shaken me. Later that day, the guest asked if I wanted to go out. He'd heard about a flea market outside town and thought it might be a good way to spend a quiet afternoon. I hesitated. I told myself there was no harm in going. That it was just two people browsing old objects, like we'd done before. But I also knew it wouldn't be the same. The drive was longer this time. We passed through unfamiliar neighborhoods, winding roads with trees arching overhead. We didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't awkward. It was expectant. At the market, we wandered separately at first. I browsed through tables of ceramic bowls and faded postcards, running my fingers over rough edges and wondering who had once owned them. He found an old compass and held it up to me with a half-smile. "Still works," he said. I nodded, smiling back. Everything old does, in some way. We found a vendor selling antique prints, and he pointed to one of a woman standing in a field, her back turned to the viewer. There was something haunting in the way her figure leaned toward the wind. "She reminds me of you," he said. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We left the market without buying anything. But I felt like we had taken something again, the way we did at the antique shop. A moment. A feeling. Something intangible that now belonged to both of us. On the drive back, it started to rain. Not heavily, just a soft pattering that blurred the windshield. He turned on the wipers and asked if I wanted to stop somewhere. Just for a minute. Just to rest. There was a roadside park a few miles ahead, quiet and empty beneath the gray sky. We pulled in and sat without speaking. I stared out at the wet trees and felt my breath slow. Then he reached out and gently took my hand. I didn't pull away. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't reckless. It was quiet and steady and terrifying in its simplicity. He let go after a few seconds. Nothing more was said. We drove the rest of the way in silence. That night, my husband asked how my day had been. I told him it was fine. That the rain made driving annoying. That I didn't find anything worth buying. He accepted every word without question. When he went to bed, I sat in the living room alone. The necklace still hung around my neck. I touched the pendant lightly, trying to remember what it had felt like to be content. To not be torn in two. I stayed there for a long time. listening to the rain, watching the clock, thinking about the woman in the field, leaning into the wind, wondering how long she had stood there before turning back. Or if she ever did. The next morning felt strangely clear. The rain had passed, leaving the sky pale and wide open, and the trees dripped quietly under a soft breeze. I woke earlier than usual and moved through the house as if I had somewhere to be, though there was no destination. I made coffee, tidied the living room, rearranged a stack of unread magazines, then sat in silence at the dining table watching sunlight climb the far wall. He hadn't come downstairs yet. His door was still closed, and part of me hoped it would stay that way. The other part, one I couldn't silence anymore, waited for the sound of it opening. When he finally came into the kitchen, he greeted me with a quiet morning, and poured himself a cup of coffee. His eyes flicked to me for only a second, but it was enough. We both knew. The park. The hand. The silence afterward. None of it had vanished overnight. My husband was gone again for the day. He'd left early, mentioning meetings and errands. I barely remembered his words. My mind was already elsewhere. That afternoon, I found myself wandering through the house, unable to focus. I told myself I should bake something, maybe prepare dinner early. Instead, I paced between rooms, lingering at windows, checking my reflection too often. I brushed my hair and changed my blouse twice. Not for anyone in particular. At least, that's what I tried to tell myself. He was sitting on the back porch when I joined him. The sun had warmed the wood planks, and a faint scent of cut grass hung in the air. I sat at the far end of the bench, careful to leave distance, but not too much. He didn't speak, and I didn't either. There was a kind of understanding now, one that didn't need explanation. We watched birds flit between branches, the breeze catching loose leaves and swirling them across the yard. Everything felt slow, quiet, suspended. My heart beat fast despite the stillness. When I finally stood to go inside, he stood too. It wasn't planned. I don't even know who moved first. But it happened in the space between breaths. We kissed. Just that. Nothing more. And then I walked away, without looking back. Inside the house, my hands shook as I reached for the sink. I turned on the water too hot and winced when it touched my skin. My pulse was loud in my ears. I pressed a hand to my chest and tried to breathe evenly. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have a plan. But I also didn't want to pretend that nothing was happening. That it was all imagination. That I was still the same woman I had been a month ago, a year ago, a decade ago. The kiss lingered like a mark I couldn't see but could feel. That evening, I prepared a simple dinner. Roasted vegetables, warm bread, and soup. I cooked by instinct, hands moving automatically, as if they remembered how to comfort me when my mind couldn't. The kitchen smelled of garlic and rosemary. It felt familiar. Safe. Like before. At the table, the three of us ate quietly. My husband asked about errands. I told him I had stayed home. He didn't ask more. His world was structured, compartmentalized. He trusted routines, not signs. And I had always been part of his routine. But sitting between them, between two versions of who I was and who I might become, I realized something had shifted for good. After dinner, my husband went to his study. He'd been spending more time there lately, tinkering with old tools, sorting drawers he never used. I wondered if he felt it too, the slow erosion of something unspoken. Maybe he didn't know what it was, but he must have sensed it. Some things can't be ignored forever. I stood in the hallway for a long time before I returned to the living room. He was there, our guest, sitting on the same end of the couch as before. The same lamp was on. The same quiet movie played in the background. It all looked identical, but nothing was the same. I didn't sit beside him this time. I stayed near the window, arms crossed, heart pacing. He didn't say anything. Not about earlier. Not about the past week. But I felt it in the air around us, dense and charged. I left the room before the movie ended. In my bedroom, I stood in front of the mirror and removed the necklace my husband had given me. I placed it carefully in the drawer, unsure if I was hiding it or protecting it. I lay in bed for a long time, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. I didn't cry. I didn't pray. I didn't wish for things to be different. I just breathed. Slowly. Quietly. As if learning how to do it again. There were mornings when I convinced myself that I could still walk backward. That if I retraced the moments step by step, every glance, every pause, every choice, I could find the point where this path diverged and quietly return to the other one. The safer one. The familiar one. But by the time I reached the kitchen that day, even the act of pretending felt thin, like a sweater stretched too many times across the years. I busied myself with cleaning again. The fridge shelves were wiped down twice. I reorganized the spice rack, took everything out of the pantry, and put it all back in alphabetical order. I kept my hands moving because stillness was dangerous. Stillness gave thoughts space to breathe. In the background, I heard him moving upstairs. I knew his routine now without trying to know it. When he'd shower, when he'd linger in the hallway looking at the old photographs on the wall, when he'd pause before descending the stairs. There was something deliberate about the way he moved now, like he knew I noticed, and maybe wanted me to. By midday, the air inside the house felt heavy. I opened all the windows to let in the breeze, but it only made the silence more obvious. I turned on the radio, classical music filling the space gently, and sat at the table with a cup of tea I had no intention of drinking. My phone buzzed. A message from an old friend I hadn't spoken to in months. She wrote that she'd seen my husband in town, mentioned how lucky I was to have someone so devoted and dependable. I stared at the screen, then turned it face down. Devotion can be quiet. So quiet you don't realize when it's turned into absence. Or maybe you just stop listening for it. That afternoon, he asked if I wanted to drive out to the old railway trail. A walking path that wound through the hills just outside town. I hadn't been there in years. I told him it would be nice to get out of the house. I didn't need to ask my husband, he wouldn't be home until late. The drive was peaceful, the road narrow and framed by tall trees. As we turned onto the gravel parking area, he pointed out the last time he'd been here was as a child. Something about school trips and packed lunches and sunburns. I smiled, but my chest was tight. We walked side by side. The path was worn, the wooden rails still visible beneath the dirt and grass. At one point, I stepped over a fallen branch and he instinctively reached out a hand. I took it without thinking. And didn't let go right away. The trail opened into a clearing where the remains of a rail car sat, rusted and forgotten. We stopped there, both of us quiet, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call. He sat on the edge of the rail car, elbows on his knees, looking down at the worn ground. I didn't expect any of this, he said softly. I nodded. Neither did I. I'm not trying to make this harder for you, he continued. I know, I said, though my throat was tight. He looked at me then. Really looked. The way you do when you're trying to memorize someone, or trying to decide if you're allowed to feel what you're feeling. I just don't want to disappear from your life like none of this ever mattered, he said. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My hands were trembling, so I folded them in my lap to still them. It was all too much and not enough. I felt exposed and unseen at once. We stayed in that clearing for a long time. Not touching. Not speaking. Just breathing in the weight of what wasn't being said. The drive back was silent. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, hands tight on the wheel. My mind raced with what-ifs, each one more impossible than the last. When we returned, I went straight to the kitchen and began preparing dinner. Chopping vegetables with more force than necessary, measuring spices without thought. I needed to feel grounded. The motion, the repetition, it kept the thoughts at bay. My husband came home just before sunset. He smelled faintly of sawdust. He'd spent the day helping a friend with a renovation. He looked tired but content. He kissed my cheek, washed his hands, and asked if I needed help. I told him no. I told him to sit. He did, gratefully. At dinner, he asked how my day had been. I said it had been fine. That I'd gone for a walk. That the fresh air had helped clear my head. He smiled. I'm glad. I smiled back. But it didn't reach my eyes. I felt it. I wondered if he did, too. After dinner, I cleared the plates, hands steady now. Repetition brought me that, at least. Later that evening, I stood outside on the porch alone. The stars were faint above the tree line, and the night air was cool. I pulled my shawl tighter around my shoulders and listened to the hum of distant insects. Behind me, the porch light clicked on. I didn't turn around. He stood quietly a few steps behind me, saying nothing. Just being there. And somehow, that silence said more than anything else could. We both knew where this road was headed. And neither of us had the map. The day began quietly, but with a kind of internal pressure building beneath everything. I could feel it in my skin, in the weight of each step I took. There was a sense of arrival, not a destination reached, but a line finally approached. I made the bed slower than usual, as if smoothing the sheets could delay whatever was moving toward me. I moved through the morning like someone waiting for a signal, though I didn't know what it would look like. My husband left early again. Another work meeting, another day of silence between us framed by polite gestures and shallow conversation. He kissed my forehead on the way out, said something about picking up groceries later, and was gone before I even responded. I stood at the window long after his car disappeared, the quiet of the house swelling around me like a held breath. Later that morning, I stepped outside and found him, our guest, already sitting beneath the tree in the backyard, a book resting open in his hands. He looked up, and something passed between us that didn't need words. I walked down the steps slowly and sat beside him in the grass. For a while, we said nothing. The wind rustled the leaves, and the sound of distant lawnmowers drifted from a neighboring yard. He closed his book and turned to me. I've been thinking, he said. About getting out of town. Just for a day. Somewhere quiet. Away from all this. My heart moved in my chest, but I kept my voice even. Where? There's a little place near the lake. About an hour out. Nothing special. Just trees and stillness. I hesitated. Then nodded. It wasn't about the place. It never was. We left in the early afternoon. I left a note on the kitchen counter for my husband, something about visiting a friend and taking the day to clear my head. The lie tasted neutral in my mouth. It didn't feel cruel. Just necessary. The drive was long and winding. The sky was pale blue, and the road ahead shimmered in the heat. We didn't talk much. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely on his thigh. I watched the scenery pass by, the shifting fields, the wooden fences, the wide open sky, and felt the knot inside me tighten and loosen at once. When we arrived, the motel was nearly empty. Just a row of faded doors and flower boxes filled with dry soil. He checked us in without looking at me. I waited in the car, hands folded in my lap. The room was simple. Clean. A single window with the curtains drawn, and a wooden chair in the corner with worn arms. The kind of place that had seen thousands of brief stories and forgotten them all. We didn't speak. We didn't explain. We spent the night together. The silence afterward was heavy but not awkward. I lay on the edge of the bed, watching shadows move across the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of my own breath. He was still beside me, unmoving, the space between us charged and unspoken. At some point I drifted into sleep, not deep, but enough to forget the moment for a while. Morning came slowly. Pale light filtered through the curtains, and outside, a bird called out once, then fell quiet. I sat up and found my phone beside the bed. I turned it over and saw a new message. It was from my husband. Just a sentence. Dinner's at 6. I thought we could cook together tonight. I stared at the screen. My mouth was dry. My fingers cold. I read the message again and again until the words blurred. Dinner. Cooking. Together. Together. I stood, dressed, and moved quietly around the room, unsure of what I was supposed to do now. Every action felt like it came from someone else. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the expression on my face. Not guilt. Not regret. Just the weight of what had shifted. He woke as I opened the door to leave. He didn't try to stop me. We didn't speak on the drive back. I watched the road. The fields. The trees. And in my chest, something settled and stirred all at once. The kitchen was filled with the scent of sautéed onions and garlic when I returned. My husband was standing by the stove, humming softly to himself, his sleeves rolled up and a wooden spoon in his hand. He turned when he heard the door, smiled the way he used to smile when we were younger, when we still surprised each other with small things. "You're just in time," he said. "I thought we could make that lemon chicken you like." I nodded, removed my coat, and walked toward the sink. I washed my hands slowly, watching the water swirl around my fingers, not trusting myself to speak just yet. The weight of what had happened still clung to me, not as guilt, but as something heavier, an awareness, maybe. A presence that didn't leave when the act was over. He passed me a sprig of thyme and asked if I could strip the leaves. I did, wordlessly, fingers working without thought. The familiarity of it, of cooking together, was oddly jarring. As if we were playing a part from a life we had once rehearsed long ago but hadn't performed in years. We moved around each other easily, like we always had in the kitchen. The way couples do when they've done something together 100 times, passing bowls, sharing utensils, finishing sentences without words. But it wasn't the same. Not to me. I wondered if it was to him. As we set the table, he poured 2 glasses of wine and dimmed the lights slightly. He looked at me then, really looked, and I knew, in that moment, he was trying. Trying to reach for something that had been fading between us, trying to bridge a distance he hadn't fully acknowledged until it was almost too wide. "I've been meaning to do this more often," he said. "I just forgot how much it matters." I gave him a small smile. It wasn't forced, but it wasn't whole either. I appreciated his effort. I did. But I couldn't ignore that it had come too late to stop what had already started in me. We sat and ate. He asked about my day, and I gave him a version of the truth, about walking, about clearing my head. He didn't question it. Maybe he didn't want to. Or maybe he still trusted me in the way that people do when they've spent decades assuming the same patterns will repeat forever. After dinner, I cleared the plates and began rinsing them in the sink. He came up behind me, rested a hand on my shoulder, and kissed the side of my neck gently. The gesture startled me, not because it was unwanted, but because it reminded me of the woman I used to be before I started searching for something outside this house. I stood still for a long time after he left the room. Later that evening, I went upstairs and opened the window in the bedroom. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of soil and summer. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A screen door slammed. Life continued. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the floorboards. How many steps I had taken across them. How many nights I had sat right here, folding laundry or massaging my tired feet. How many words had been spoken in this room, and how many more had gone unsaid. There was no anger in me. No shame. Just the quiet realization that I had arrived at a place where two truths could exist at once, that I still cared for my husband, and yet I had stepped outside our marriage not out of malice or resentment, but out of a hunger that had been growing in the corners of my silence. The next morning, I woke early. The house was still. My husband's soft breathing was steady beside me. I dressed quietly and made my way to the kitchen, where the light was just beginning to pour in through the windows, golden and warm. I stood there for a moment, letting it touch my face, as if sunlight could absolve me of the choices I had made. When he came down a little later, we shared a quiet breakfast. He talked about his schedule for the day, about needing to stop by the hardware store, about a package that hadn't arrived. I nodded, offered polite responses, but my thoughts were far away. I excused myself mid-morning and went for a walk. Not far. Just through the neighborhood, past the same houses and fences I'd passed for years. Every porch, every mailbox looked exactly as it always had, but I felt different walking among them. Like a version of me had quietly been erased, and another had taken her place without anyone noticing. Back at home, I checked the mail and found a small envelope addressed to me in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a folded note with just a few words. I meant what I said. I won't forget. J. I folded the paper back and tucked it between the pages of an old cookbook in the kitchen. Not to hide it, but to give it a place somewhere it could sit quietly, just like the truth I now carried with me. That night, as I stood brushing my hair in front of the mirror, I saw my husband's reflection behind me. He watched me, then crossed the room and wrapped his arms loosely around my waist. I let him. We stood like that for a while, saying nothing. He kissed my temple and whispered, "You felt distant lately." I've noticed. I looked at our reflections, his face close to mine, the lines around his eyes deeper than they used to be. I know, I said. It was the only truth I could offer him. He nodded, squeezed my hand once, and stepped away to turn down the bed. And I stood there a moment longer, wondering how long we could go on like this. Wondering what he truly sensed, and what he chose not to ask. Wondering how many more dinners we would cook together while I carried a version of myself he would never fully know. The days that followed blurred into one another like soft brushstrokes of a painting I no longer felt I had control over. The colors were muted, subtle shades of obligation, memory, and unspoken thoughts. I moved through them with care, conscious of every step I took, every word I chose to say or not say. There was no longer a sense of urgency, only a quiet awareness that something had already broken, even if the pieces were still in place. The letter remained hidden in the cookbook. I didn't reread it, but I knew the words by heart. They echoed occasionally in my mind when the house was silent, when the wind brushed the curtains, when my husband's hand touched mine during dinner. He had grown more attentive since that night we cooked together. He lingered longer in the kitchen, asked more questions about my day, made subtle efforts to close the distance he had only recently realized existed. But no matter how close he stood, I felt an invisible layer between us. Not resentment. Not shame. Just the irreversible reality of what had happened. That morning, as I made the bed and straightened the corners of the sheets, I caught myself humming an old melody. One I hadn't heard in years. I didn't even know I remembered it. The sound startled me, as if some buried version of myself had momentarily risen to the surface. After breakfast, I told my husband I was going to the antique shop. I hadn't been back since that first visit, and I wasn't sure why I wanted to go again, only that I did. He offered to drive me, but I declined, saying I wanted the time to myself. He didn't press. The shop looked the same. Dusty glass, faded price tags, shelves cluttered with forgotten things. I moved slowly between the aisles, running my fingers over the worn edges of books and boxes. I paused at a framed photo of a woman in a long dress, standing at the edge of a field. Her face was turned away from the camera. She looked like she was waiting for something. I stood there longer than I should have. Eventually, I walked to the back, to the same corner where I had once stood and seen him watching me through a mirror. The mirror was gone now. Replaced by an old clock, its hand stuck at 11:17. I didn't buy anything. I wasn't there to bring anything home. I was there to remember who I had been in that moment, not the kiss, not the spark, but the feeling of being seen. When I got back to the house, the guest room door was open. His things were gone. There was no note. No goodbye. No explanation. Just absence. My breath caught, and I stood there, frozen in the hallway. I didn't call out. I didn't ask where he went. Because I already knew. He had left the way he came, in silence, without warning, without disrupting the life he was never meant to stay in. That evening, my husband handed me an envelope. "It came while you were out," he said. "From your sister, I think." I took it with a nod, though I knew it wasn't from her. Inside was a single page. A thank you note for the place to stay. No mention of anything more. No hint of what had passed between us. Just closure, folded neatly into polite sentences. I burned it in the sink that night. The paper curled quickly, blackened edges folding inward like petals. The flame was small but steady, and when it was done, I rinsed the ashes down the drain and wiped the sink clean. For the next few days, I moved quietly through my routines. I didn't mention that he had gone. My husband didn't bring it up either. It was as if we had agreed, wordlessly, that nothing needed to be said. And yet, the silence between us deepened. It wasn't cold. It wasn't even unkind. It was simply there, like a shared secret neither of us was ready to look at directly. One morning, as we sat on the porch with coffee, my husband broke the quiet. "I've been thinking," he said, eyes on the distant trees. "Maybe we should go away for a weekend. Just the two of us." I nodded. "That might be nice." He reached over and touched my hand. It was gentle, familiar. His thumb traced a small circle on the back of my wrist. "I miss the way we used to be," he said. "I know I haven't always been the best at showing it. But I want to try." I looked at him then, not at his words, but at his effort. At the man who had built this life with me, even if parts of it had cracked while neither of us was watching. "I'm still here," I said. It was the only truth I had left to give him in that moment. That night, as we lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the sound of his breathing. Steady. Trusting. And I wondered how many lives we live within a single one. How many versions of ourselves we lose and rediscover and lose again. And whether forgiveness, true, quiet, lasting forgiveness, can begin before the truth is ever fully spoken. The following week passed with the quiet resolve of someone learning to breathe through something unspoken. Each day settled into itself like folded laundry, neatly stacked, soft at the edges, bearing weight without appearing to. There was no more pretending that life had not changed. Only the effort to keep moving inside the change, like learning how to walk again after your balance is lost. My husband suggested the lake. He said it casually over morning coffee, spoon tapping lightly against his cup. We haven't been in years, he said. Thought it might be good. A day out. I nodded, not because I wanted to go, but because he needed me to. And I owed him that, at least my presence, if not yet the version of myself he remembered. We packed sandwiches and a blanket. He put on his old straw hat that made him look slightly older than he was, and I wore a long cardigan, though the day was warm. The drive was familiar. The trees still lined the highway in quiet rows, and the lake still appeared suddenly after a curve, wide and still like a breath held between words. We didn't speak much during the drive, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was a sense of shared memory between us. The kind that doesn't need to be spoken aloud to be felt. When we arrived, he spread the blanket near the shore and opened the picnic basket. He poured lemonade into 2 glass jars we'd brought from home. I sat beside him and watched the water shift in lazy ripples, the afternoon sun casting glints across its surface like broken glass. There was a kind of peace in it. Not absolution. Not resolution. But a stillness I hadn't felt in weeks. He lay back on the blanket with his hands behind his head and stared up at the sky. Remember the last time we came here? He asked. Yes, I said. I forgot the sandwiches, and we ended up eating just apples. And a melted chocolate bar, I added. He smiled. Best lunch we ever had. I smiled too, though the memory came from another life. A version of us that existed long before now. Before the space between words widened. Before other eyes found me. Before I let them. After lunch, we walked along the water's edge. The sand was soft and cool beneath our shoes, and the breeze carried the faint scent of pine. We said little. Just pointed out the occasional bird, or a boat in the distance, or a rock that looked like something else entirely. We reached the old wooden dock that had once been used for fishing. He sat at the edge, and I joined him, feet dangling above the water. I'm glad we came, he said. I looked at him. Really looked. His eyes had lines around them I hadn't noticed before. His hands, resting on his knees, bore the quiet wear of a man who had built things and carried them too long. I saw love there. Not the kind that burns, but the kind that stays when everything else fades. There, with the lake stretched out in front of us and the quiet weight of so many years between us, I felt the truth rise like a tide. I turned to him slowly. I have to tell you something. He didn't look surprised. Just still. My voice was low. Unsteady, but clear. While he was here, something happened. He didn't speak. I didn't plan it. I didn't expect it. But I didn't stop it either. Still, he said nothing. Just stared out over the water, the breeze playing gently with the brim of his hat. I don't expect forgiveness, I said. I couldn't carry it alone anymore. He nodded slowly. Not in agreement. Not in understanding. Just as if he'd heard me. Really heard me. The silence that followed was heavy, but it didn't crush us. After a while, he stood and offered me his hand. I hesitated, then took it. We walked back in silence. The drive home was quiet, but not the same kind of quiet that had filled the house before. It was raw. Open. Like air after a storm, damp, unsettled, but clean. That evening, we didn't speak about it again. We sat on the porch, each in our own chair, watching the last of the light stretch across the yard. The sound of cicadas rose and fell like breathing. And I realized that there are many ways a marriage can break. But sometimes, if both people are still standing after the pieces fall, it doesn't have to end there. Not with a clean slate. Not with perfect healing. But with the willingness to keep sitting in the same room, even when it hurts. To keep showing up when it would be easier to retreat. To try again, not because it's easy. But because somewhere beneath everything that changed, something was still there, waiting to be chosen. And maybe, just maybe, we both were.